Bonjour, bienvenue donc ici au Palais de Chaillot.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Palais de Chaillot.
Merci donc à l'assistance et merci
Thank you very much to the participants and the organizers. This roundtable is called Oceans at the Crossroads of Biodiversity, Climate and Security Issues. I am thrilled to be here with you all today. I'd just like to give some numbers. The oceans cover 70% of the Earth's surface, produce 70% of oxygen, and Nice was only the third conference about the oceans. The oceans are also at the center of geopolitical questions. World powers compete to have power over the oceans because they have strategic importance. Oceans are at the origin of life, but they have been forgotten in the defense for the environment. How can we talk about sovereignty when it comes to the oceans? I think that we will be discussing this today. With us here today, Admiral Christophe Prézuc. He is a former General Staff member of the Armed Forces between 2016 and 2020. You are the director of the Ocean Institute of the Sorbonne University Alliance. Thank you for being with us today. Julia Tass is also with us. She is head of the Ocean Program at IRIS, and she is also part of the Observatory on Climate and the Environment. Thank you very much for being with us here today. Joining us as well, Captain Jérôme Chardon. Thank you very much for being with us, Captain. You are at the Armed Forces as well. And last but not least, Cyril Poirier-Coutances, who's Director of the Naval Strategic Studies Center. Thank you for being here today. First question for you, Admiral. We often hear that the oceans have been forgotten when it comes to climate negotiations, but in terms of biodiversity, security and climate, they have a central role. And the lack of research and of data has brought us to create the Bougainville mission, which is dear to your heart. Yes, this is a project that is very important to me, but to come back to the crises that you mentioned, these three crises are different: the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the international relations crisis. These are different crises, but they are interwoven, and they join where the oceans are. The climate crisis is warming the ocean, acidifying the ocean, reducing oxygen levels, and transforms the physical characteristics of the ocean. And in so doing, the transformation of the ocean linked to climate has a consequence on human beings, beings that are in the ocean. This has an impact on biodiversity. This isn't the only driver of biodiversity loss. There's pollution, overexploitation of coastal areas, but it is an aggravating factor in the biodiversity crisis. And the last crisis that you mentioned is the multilateralism and international relations crisis. We often talk about the oceans, but there is only one ocean. Oceans are interlinked, and fish know no borders, heat waves know no borders, nor do cyclones. So understanding the ocean is to have a holistic vision and international cooperation. Everything that will limit international cooperation and scientific cooperation, or if you talk about limiting plastic pollution or decarbonization of maritime transport, all of these challenges that we encounter will have consequences on our understanding of the ocean. They will mean that we lose power in the face of these issues, but also make us ignorant as to what is going on. You may say, so what? What if we lose species of sea animals? What is the issue? And there are many answers to this when it comes to biodiversity. But I will take three simple examples. First, competition for resources. If biodiversity changes, if the oceans change, species will migrate. They will go to parts of the ocean
Mais les espèces qui ne peuvent pas bouger,
that are different. But the species that cannot migrate will either have to adapt, or generally speaking, they will disappear.
les zones de pêche
And this means that fishing areas will change as well.
pour la
Therefore,
ressource halieutique va
The
être
competition
plus dur
for
qu'aujourd'hui.
fishing
Et aujourd'hui,
resources
c'est pas une
will
vue de
be
l'esprit, la
fiercer than
compétition pour les
today.
ressources halieutiques. Ce sont quasiment des batailles navales en mer.
And
En mer de
these
Chine
are
du Sud,
naval
dans le
battles,
golfe,
competition
dans le
for
golfe de
fishing
Guinée.
species.
Voilà. 3
In
milliards
the
de
Gulf of Guinea,
personnes
for
dépendent
instance,
des ressources
or in the
halieutiques
China
pour
Sea.
leurs
3
protéines,
million
pour leurs ressources en
people
protéines.
depend
Voilà, premier
on
exemple. Un
fishing
deuxième exemple, ce
resources
sont les catastrophes
for their
naturelles.
subsistence. Then we can
On
talk
entend
about
tous aujourd'hui
natural
parler de la Jamaïque, on entend
catastrophes.
tous parler de
We've
Cuba.
heard about
On
what's
sait que
happening in
ces
Jamaica and
catastrophes
Cuba,
naturelles
and we
vont
know that
avoir une
these
puissance démultipliée.
catastrophes
Il y a
will
quelques années,
have large-ranging
le PDG
consequences.
d'AXA, une compagnie d'assurance,
A few
disait,
years ago,
un
the
monde
CEO
à
of
plus 4
AXA, an
degrés
insurance
n'est pas
company,
assurable.
said that a world with
Ça,
4
c'est une
degrees
prévision
more
économique, mais en vérité,
is not
ça veut dire
insurable.
il n'est pas réparable.
And this is a forecast, but this means that
Ça
we
veut dire
cannot
qu'un monde à
repair
plus
a
4
planet
degrés,
with
une fois
4
que
degrees
une
Celsius
catastrophe
more than what we
naturelle
have
se sera
today.
répandue sur un pays,
And once a
le
natural
pays
catastrophe
pourrait ne
hits
pas
a
s'en
country,
relever.
the
Un
country
pays comme la France
might
s'en
not be
relèvera,
able
mais
to
des pays
recover.
plus petits, je
A
pense
country
à
like
Mayotte,
France
l'année
might be
dernière
able
touchée
to, but
par
I'm thinking
Chido.
of smaller
Sans-
countries.
sans
I'm
la-
thinking about
mais la
Mayotte,
France,
which was hit by Chido.
on peut se poser
Without
des questions
France's
sur la
support,
capacité
we
d'un-
may ask
d'un
ourselves
pays comme
questions
celle-là
about the
à
capacity of
se
an island such as
reconstruire.
Mayotte
Ça
to
veut dire
rebuild itself.
probablement des faillites d'État.
And this
On a
also
quelques États
points
comme ça qui se sont
to
effondrés.
state
Eh
shortcomings.
bien,
We
dans
have
les
certain
décennies
states
qui
that
viennent,
crumbled.
ces
And in the
crises-là,
decades to
ce sont
come,
également des crises
these
politiques, des
crises
crises
are
d'effondrement
also
d'État.
political
Et mon dernier
crises linked to
point
states crumbling.
d'illustration,
And my
ce sont les
last
côtes. C'est
example
l'urbanisme côtier.
is
On
coastal
sait que dans cette
areas.
transformation climatique,
And
l'océan se
the
dilate,
building of
le
these
niveau de la
areas.
mer augmente,
We know that
mais
the
il augmente
ocean
pas
is
partout de la même
dilating, that
manière.
sea levels are
Il y a des
rising,
endroits où il va
but this is
baisser.
not
Au fond du
uniform.
golfe
In
de
certain
Botnie, en
areas, sea
Finlande,
levels
la mer
will
va baisser de 1
diminish.
En Bretagne,
In Finland,
elle
for
va monter
instance,
de 1
it
mètre.
will
Mais dans des
reduce
endroits
by
comme
1 meter.
Jakarta, elle va
But in
monter de
certain
3,80
places like
mètres.
Jakarta, sea levels will
La
rise by
population autour de Jakarta, c'est
3.80
30 millions de
meters,
personnes.
and the population around Jakarta is estimated at 30 million people. Ho Chi Minh University has already imagined that 17 million people who live in the Mekong Delta will be submerged. And this will lead to population movements. And this will also lead to political tensions. So what does the Bougainville mission have to do with this? The University of the Sorbonne and the Navy, supported by several French authorities, have decided to contribute to acquiring knowledge about the ocean. As Sylvia Hurl said, our first difficulty is ignorance. Our first challenge is ignorance. The ocean is much less well known than the atmosphere. And so we have to study the ocean in order to better understand it and to predict what we will do when the ocean evolves. That's what we've been doing within our mission. We have been observing the ocean's microbiome. And this is the smallest factor. It may seem the least significant factor. These are microorganisms which are responsible for the creation of 50% of oxygen on our planet, and this is at the basis of our food chain. So we have implemented studies in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, observations of this microbiome, which will allow us to have a specific insight into the ocean's health. These will be unique data, and these will be tools for international cooperation in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Thank you very much. Julia Tass, the Admiral was telling us that we are missing data and research. I think that within the program that you are working on the impact of climate change on the ocean, as well as the consequences, you will not contradict what was just said. But what research has been done vis-à-vis climate change, and how can this feed into defense and security issues? These are usually disconnected, but how can we connect them? And how can defense help scientific research? The Admiral already talked about some of these questions and has already offered certain answers in terms of how the Navy can help by involving young students within the Bougainville mission. But to go back to some of the things that were just stated, oceans are at the heart of the climate system. The ocean has a regulatory role when it comes to the climate. We talked about the impact of oxygen production for phytoplankton and the repercussions on the balance of the atmosphere, but we have to understand that circulation within the ocean redistributes heat between the equator and the Earth's poles. So the ocean's role as a regulator of the climate has been understood over the past few decades, and this has been modeled by mathematical models. Research is ongoing, but if and when we understand the ocean's central role when it comes to climate systems, we can understand the impact that we will have as a human species through climate change and the erosion of biodiversity on global balance. And if the food chain loses balance, this will have an impact on fishing, for instance, and this will contribute to the warming of water. This endangers coral reefs, which are fundamental for tourism on certain islands. So there is overlap between environmental factors and socioeconomic stability factors, therefore political stability factors. Often, these fields will be dissociated, but what is interesting in the marine environment is that it is at the periphery of many different fields of study. So we will have a vision of the world as Europeans, which we call the Mercator projection. We divide the Pacific Ocean in half, and by dividing it in half, Europe is in the middle of the map. But what is implied through this division is that maritime spaces are at the periphery of geopolitical studies. In the same manner, mathematical models are more specific for studies of the atmosphere than they are for ocean circulation. So by placing the oceans at the periphery of fields of study, we have let uncertainty come to the fore, and we are at a crucial moment today where we are moving forward in terms of marine science, physics, biology, but we are also moving forward when it comes to geopolitics. And so we can still bring together the social and human sciences and the natural sciences, and this is of the essence. This is what we do at IRIS. We bring all of these topics together, and the Climate and Environment Observatory has published, at the request of the Ministry of the Armed Forces, data with certain areas of focus, focusing on certain regions or certain stakes. We, for instance, study fishing or circulation in the North Atlantic, and this is a tipping point from a climate standpoint. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has identified 9 climate tipping points on the world stage, and among those, many tipping points are either within the ocean, in coral reefs, but also at the poles, the Arctic and the Antarctic. And there is one tipping point in the ocean, which is the collapse of circulation, which redistributes the atmosphere's heat. So the studies that have been carried out in order to help institutions to make decisions in terms of adaptation is to understand the consequences of a tipping point on the geopolitical stability of a region or on the armed forces. So it would be quite long to detail the conclusions of this study, but we will work on a daily basis with the armed forces and the Ministry of the Armed Forces and of Foreign Affairs on how to map in the most specific way possible the consequences of climate change on marine ecosystems and coastal ecosystems, as well as on the populations which use these ecosystems, and on a larger scale, on regions and regional balance and geopolitical balance. Thank you very much, Julia. Captain Chardon, you are a vessel captain, and you intervene after natural catastrophes. But there are several factors to this: adapting infrastructure, as well as prevention measures. Can you explain how to articulate these different elements? And I would also like you to tell us about the Kiwi Kwakwa operation. Is that the right way of pronouncing it? Kiwi Kwakwa. Yes.
J'y viendrai tout à l'heure. Donc, merci tout d'abord.
Yes, I will get to that later. Thank you very much for today's invitation. The stage has been set, the backdrop described, and we can see at what point there are concrete consequences in terms of the ocean for the armed forces. It is a vector of tension, but also of military cooperation. There are three levels of action for the armed forces: reaction, anticipation, and adaptation. So reaction is the first thing that I think of in terms of intervening after a natural catastrophe. So bringing relief to populations and the rebuilding of the state. I will take an example: Hurricane Irma in St. Bart's. After this hurricane, which was the most powerful in recent history, everything was destroyed, so the state could no longer function, and the Navy intervened with infrastructure which brought first aid and in order to re-establish the state's functioning, if you will. And this shows how natural catastrophes have a consequence on daily life. So all of these structures will be useful for cases which are not linked to climate change, such as earthquakes, but we will return to that when we talk about Kiwi Kwakwa. I'm going to take another example from another region in the South Pacific. Last December, the Vanuatu Assist operation took place after the earthquake, and our forces intervened in this country. There was coordination, community-based coordination. France, Australia, and New Zealand cooperated, but there was also the implementation of an operational response in the Pacific, which helped to implement this operation. So in concrete terms, we can see the evolution of military systems in order to deal with the consequences of natural catastrophes. And all of this will facilitate information exchange, particularly when it comes to weather systems. This project was temporary. It was created last year. From summer 2026, it will become a permanent operation with permanent French presence. Military staff will be deployed in that area, ready to intervene. The second aspect, when it comes to intervening, is related to illegal fishing and the migration of fish species. And so we have to fight against trafficking in this regard. The Admiral talked about the Gulf of Guinea, and 40% of the fish in this region is fished in an illicit manner. And these are extra-regional fleets which are responsible for this decline, which has an impact on socioeconomic structures in the region. The Navy and the armed forces contribute to stability and partnership with countries from the Gulf of Guinea who are very pleased with this cooperation. And to provide an example, when we are present, 40% of days at sea are destined to fighting illegal fishing with the help of our partners. When it comes to adaptation, there are other issues that are linked to climate change.
aux disparitions d'espèces qui vont rendre certaines
and to
espèces
the disappearance of certain species. Certain species will become rarer, more expensive, and more interesting for people who traffic them. In 2024, the MANTA operation to fight against trafficking in the West Indies allowed us to work on a species that was endangered. So there are new forms of trafficking that come to the fore. When we talk about fighting against illicit fishing, this isn't a purely military question. It is not members of the armed forces who are working on this. This is an interministerial process, and the Secretary General of the Oceans is tasked with coming up with a strategy to fight against illegal and illicit fishing. There are three aspects: legal, operational, and cooperation. And so four things come out of this: the need to understand what is happening in terms of trafficking. There may be a building that is supposed to be working on fishing, but it may also work on human trafficking or trafficking in endangered species. So there is a permanent mission of the Navy which seeks to identify the situation at sea. And in France, we have an expertise center in order to ensure maritime safety, Maritime Awareness Center. And this center works with other entities and creates a network which helps us to have an overall picture in order to fight against trafficking. Once again, there's a recent example from last week. The defense ministers' meeting in the South Pacific, as well as France. This meeting took place, and a joint communiqué was published on the 25th of October, a few days ago, and this press release talks about the fight against transnational organized crime, and this conference allowed us to make strides in terms of cooperation. The second need surrounds common structures when it comes to maritime information sharing. And so we need to have machines which exchange data. The EU plays an important role in this regard with two programs: Crises, which is implemented in the Indian Ocean and is being developed in the South Pacific. And the next step will be to develop this project in Southeast Asia. In Polynesia, this tool is being used and helps our partners. The third need is the need to patrol in order to detect issues and intervene on time. And then we also need to work on training to ensure that we protect the marine environment, marine security. Academies have been put in place with the help of the armed forces, as well as the support of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with the Defense and Security Division, which is working in this regard. And so both ministries are working hand in hand. And I will conclude talking about anticipation and prevention. The Kivikwaka project is a small-scale project at the moment. We are working in French Polynesia with around 150 birds in order to detect weather data, to understand the behavior of these birds, so that when there is a natural phenomenon that is unusual, we will be able to save time in anticipating these threats through the study of these birds. And the Navy is also working because scientists are working on different isolated islands in order to study the birds. And so all of this is being taken into account to manage the evolutions of climate change. All right, well, we have 20 minutes left, so we are going to speed up. Cyril Poirier.
De pêche illégale, de pêche INN, donc pêche illégale et non réglementée.
We were talking about illegal and non-regulated fishing. The Strategic Center of the Navy has allowed us to take stock of the situation and also to explore ways of fighting this. And I will move on to the next question. After the ratification of the High Seas Treaty,
c'est-à-dire ces eaux internationales qui ne sont sous
These
autorité
international
d'aucun État,
waters,
qui représentent quand
which
même
are not
64%
under
des
national
océans,
jurisdiction, represent
Quid de la mise en
64%
application et
of the
puis
oceans.
quid des
So,
aires marines
what can we
protégées?
say about
J'ai
the
rassemblé les deux
application
questions.
of this?
Oui,
I
je
have
sais.
merged
Vous
two
avez l'esprit de
questions
synthèse.
together. I know that you will be able
Non,
to
d'abord sur
address
les
all of
ressources
this.
halieutiques, parce que c'est un point effectivement
In
qui a été
terms of
évoqué, l'amiral
fishing
soulignait que
resources,
3
the
milliards
Admiral
d'êtres humains
talked
dépendent
about
de ces
this. He
ressources
talked
halieutiques.
about
Le dernier
the
rapport
fact
de la
that
FAO, qui
3
a été
million
publié
people
au
depend
moment
on
de
these
son émission,
resources. The
faisait un
FAO's
bel état des
most
lieux,
recent
c'est-à-dire qu'on a
report
aujourd'hui,
took stock of the situation.
plus de 35% des
Today we
stocks
have more than
qui sont pêchés
35%
de
of
façon,
fishing stock, which
trop importante.
is being
35%. Dans les années
overfished.
1970, on était à
35%. In the
Donc,
70s, this number
on
was
a une
10%.
augmentation de ce point de vue-là.
So there is a
Quand on-
rise
et
in this regard.
Il faut bien avoir conscience que ces 35%
And we have to
qui sont
realize
pêchés
that
de
these
manière, trop
35%, which
importante,
are being
la pêche
overfished,
INN a un
the
impact
IUU fishing,
très
so
important dans
illegal
ce
and
domaine-là,
illicit
parce qu'on
fishing,
estime
has
aujourd'hui, alors
important
c'est forcément des
consequences
estimations,
because
parce que c'est une pêche illégale,
today
etc.,
there
mais on
are
estime aujourd'hui
estimates in
qu'un
terms of
poisson sur
illegal
5
and illicit
aujourd'hui dans le
fishing.
monde est
One
pêché
fish
de
out of
manière
5
illégale ou non déclarée
is
ou
being
non réglementée.
fished
Donc
in
c'est
an
considérable.
illegal or
Donc ça a un impact sur les ressources
non-regulatory
halieutiques qui est
way.
colossal aussi.
And this has
Ce qui est intéressant,
repercussions
poisson sur six,
on
je crois,
fishing resources.
1 sur 5.
Un poisson
Sorry,
sur
did you
six
say?
mangé
Yes.
dans le
One
monde
out
est
of
pêché par des
6
des bateaux
fish
chinois.
eaten in the world
ça, oui,
is
ça,
fished
c'est un
by
autre sujet parce que
Chinese ships.
La pêche chinoise n'est pas forcément
Légale.
illégale, non déclarée.
Et
non
non
Well,
déclarée.
Chinese fishing may not be
non,
legal,
un
or
sur
perhaps
cinq.
it
Et donc,
is
c'est un
non-declared,
enjeu
undeclared.
qui est important. Ce qui est
So this is
intéressant, c'est
an important
les moyens de lutte et de
stake.
voir aussi
But we have
la
to talk about
résilience
how
des
to
écosystèmes.
combat
Quand
this
vous
and
regardez,
think
vous avez
about the resilience of
aujourd'hui, parce qu'au niveau
ecosystems.
global, donc on a ces 35%,
Today, if we
mais vous
take
avez des zones de pêche
a holistic
dans
picture,
lesquelles,
there are
ça se passe
fishing
plutôt bien.
zones
La
in
zone du
which
Pacifique Nord-Est, par exemple, les
things are
stocks
all right.
sont
In the
exploités de
Eastern
façon
Pacific
conforme,
zone,
quasiment à 100%.
stocks are being
En
exploited
Antarctique, de la
properly,
même
but
manière.
in the Antarctic, this is
Vous avez
also
aussi
the
des
case.
programmes internationaux, hein,
But there are
le
also
programme des
international
Nations Unies,
programs
notamment a lancé un
led by the
programme
UN.
concernant le thon dans les années 2010.
There's
Et
a
aujourd'hui,
program
on est
related
revenu
to
à des
tuna
stocks.
in the
Donc, le
2010s.
thon est une espèce
And today we have, well,
qui était très problématique il y a une
tuna used to
dizaine,
be a
une
very
quinzaine d'années. On est revenu à
problematic
des stocks qui sont,
species a few
plutôt
years ago, but we
intéressants
have
aujourd'hui.
returned
Et
to
sur une pêche qui est plutôt
levels
intéressante. Donc,
that
on a
are
des moyens
more
d'action.
normal today. So we have deployed
On a la marine
means of
nationale contribue aux
action,
autres marines dans le monde aussi. Et
and
puis,
the Navy is
Julia
working
qui
on these
évoquait,
projects. And
les points de
Julia
bascule,
was talking
identifiés par
about
le
the
GIEC.
question of tipping
Et
points identified
ce qu'on
by
peut
the
voir aussi, c'est
IPCC.
qu'au niveau des océans,
And what
on
we
est
can
aussi
also
à un point de
see
bascule
is
du
that
point de vue de la
we are
connaissance
at a tipping
et
point when
donc
it
de la
comes
surveillance.
to knowledge and
Point de
surveillance
bascule
of the
parce que,
oceans. I
on va être en
am referring to a
capacité
tipping point
d'avoir
because
beaucoup
we
plus
will
de
be
données
able
numériques en
to
provenance
have
des océans.
more
Beaucoup plus de
data,
capteurs, à la
more
fois des drones, à la
sensors,
fois, des capteurs
drones,
satellites. Donc, en ayant beaucoup plus de
satellite
données,
sensors,
via
and
l'intelligence artificielle, on va être en
having more
capacité
data
aussi de
through
traiter
AI,
de
we will
façon
be
beaucoup
able
plus optimale ces
to
données et donc de mieux
deal
connaître.
with this data better
Et en
in order
connaissant
to
mieux, de mieux
equip
surveiller,
ourselves with knowledge
de mieux
better,
agir
to
aussi.
monitor
Ça, de ce point de vue-là, c'est
in a more
quelque
efficient
chose qui va
manner.
compter, donc, sur la deuxième
And from this
partie de
point
la
of
question.
view, this will
Pour
be
la-
relevant to the second
l'ensemble
part of
du
your
traité sur la haute
question
mer, parce que
when
le
it
traité
comes
sur la haute
to
mer,
the treaty on the high seas.
Si on prend un de ces piliers qui est donc
If we
la
take
création des aires marines protégées
one of the
en haute mer,
pillars in terms of
on peut
protecting
effectivement
marine
ne pas
zones
créer
and
des
high
aires marines
seas,
protégées en haute mer, mais ce qu'il y a
we
derrière,
will be able
après,
to
c'est la
protect,
surveillance
to
de
create
ces aires marines protégées.
protected zones, but then we will have to monitor these protected areas and intervene
Il y aura ça,
through
mais ensuite, il faut aussi
satellites
être en
or other
capacité
mechanisms.
d'avoir, ça sera
Yes,
vraisemblablement sous le régime de
but
la loi
we
du
will
pavillon,
also
donc, les marines
have to
devront
have
intervenir. Donc, il faut avoir à la
navies
fois,
intervening,
de l'intelligence artificielle
which
pour
means
traiter
that
les
we
données,
will have to
justement,
use
et
AI
surveiller ces
to
aires marines
deal with the
protégées,
data
et
in order
moyens
to
pour
monitor these
dans le
protected
cadre de ces aires
zones
marines
and also
protégées.
deploy the
Donc,
means
on
to
est
act
aussi,
in these
ce qui
protected
est,
zones.
Il y a le constat qui est inquiétant.
So
Ce qui est
what we can
plutôt
observe
rassurant
today
d'une
is
certaine manière,
worrying,
c'est que les
but
écosystèmes sont
we
aussi
may be
résilients. Donc,
reassured
si on agit,
because
on a
ecosystems
des
are
capacités
resilient. So if
pour
we
certains
act,
écosystèmes pour
we
faire ça
have
pour eux. Et on est
the
aussi à un
capacity to
point de
protect
bascule avec
ecosystems,
ces-
and we are
ces
also
données
at a
numériques
tipping
et ces
point when
moyens
it
de
comes
surveillance qui
to
vont être multipliés. Donc, on
data
est vraiment un petit peu à un
and
carrefour de ce
surveillance
point de vue-là.
mechanisms.
Juste une petite question rapidement.
I'd just like to ask you a quick question.
On va dire, ou la semi-absence. On sait que par exemple,
What
les speakers,
impact
les chercheurs lors de
we
la
know
conférence
that
des Nations Unies américains n'étaient pas là. Aujourd'hui,
American
quelles sont les
researchers and
implications
speakers were not present at the Nice Ocean Conference. So
mais en tout cas,
what are
de la
the
non-participation,
consequences
des
of
chercheurs américains
the
à
lack of
toutes
participation
les
of American
études
researchers
qui comportent le mot
when we
climat,
think about
notamment?
all of the studies related to climate?
L'UNOC à Nice, avec l'absence de représentation politique.
Well, you're talking about the absence of American political representation and American researchers which were invited and who could not attend. There are concrete risks when it comes to observations, such as in the context of the Argo project, which was mentioned earlier by Cyril. Half of the observation drones are financed by the United States. And so there will be a dramatic reduction of observation carried out. And then there's the question of political will. I noticed that a few days ago, the US delayed treaties on the decarbonization of maritime transport. 3.5% of these emissions are linked to these vessels. And so there is a negative consequence in terms of climate policy carried by Europe.
Un premier point sur, pour rebondir sur ce qui a été dit.
Maybe I'd like to go back to what was just said.
On parle à la fois de données sur
We
la
talk
navigation,
about
sur la
data
pêche,
on navigation,
on
on
parle de données
fishing.
En réalité,
talked
comme ça,
about scientific
a été
data.
abordé par tous les autres intervenants.
Everyone talked about that right now. I mean, what is specific with marine areas is that we have security actors and they have a key role to play when it comes to protecting biodiversity. The French Navy, but also coastal guards in other countries. So it comes down to the security and defense issues, but also the environmental one. So basically, what do we have with the Trump administration here? There are two things that can be detrimental for defending marine protected areas. There are fewer commitment when it comes to marine areas. They cut down budgets when it comes to ocean and atmosphere surveillance, and it was important all around the world. So, less financing. And then second, Trump believes that marine areas and marine transport are at the heart of economic issues. And that was summed up.
Ships are the new chips.
Ships are the new chips. So basically, vessels are the new processors and semiconductors. So marine transport becomes once again crucial, and for these reasons, Trump did all he could when it came to threats. He tried to hamper negotiations that not necessarily have to do with the climate only, but it had to do also with the International Organization of Marine Transport. So you have interests by the Trump administration when it comes to marine transport. And on top of that, you had less commitment when it comes to protecting marine areas. So you'll have less data collection, and this will have repercussions too on international scientific cooperation. So we'll have to overhaul data collection mechanisms. It's true that the US played a key role in the past, and now we need to come up with new institutes. We need to identify new institutes, and we need to have new funds. Who will be able to replace these American funds? You know, when it comes to peacekeeping missions, and because we say that nature doesn't like blank spaces, it will find a solution. We tend to say that China is always here to take on the challenge. But it circles back to what was just said. I mean, as of today, 56% of the action comes from the US. But what is important is to have a better distribution all around the world. When you have a key actor or player just like the US that is thinking about moving away from its previous commitment, it could be very detrimental. So instead of replacing one big player with another big player, I think it would be better to all work hand in hand. In the EU, for instance, in this context, we're about a fourth of funding. We could do better, and maybe we could turn to other countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, making sure that the system keeps on running.
Moi, j'avais une petite question sur le traité de Madrid qui...
Now about the Madrid Treaty that will end in 2047. The Antarctic, as you know, the Antarctic is only for research and researchers. When it comes to environmental protection here, could we see again a lack of commitment by the US? Could we see a sort of divide, a gap between international relations when it comes also to abiding by international treaties? We're not just talking about the US, but do you think that we could actually challenge this treaty that dates back to 1991? A couple of things here about the Madrid Protocol. It will be negotiated. It could be negotiated, but fingers crossed it won't be renegotiated. So this protocol is part of the Antarctic treaty system, and this is a real framing system. You have scientific research, scientific collaboration. You have no land claims there, and Cyril talked about fishing a couple of moments ago, and in that region you have regulated, and you have creel fishing, for instance, small shrimps that is very key for the food chain, and this potential renegotiation of the protocol brings a couple of things. The Arctic could be used for other ends, not necessarily just for fishing purposes, and honestly, I don't think that the negotiations won't start again, because climate change, yes, is responsible for melting ice caps, but we need to have more access to these areas, and it's the reason why some of the players are hungry for more resources, and in this context, we'll be able to use the resources in the Earth poles. Captain, anything else to add? From a military standpoint, south of the 62 latitude, there is no military support, no one supporting the scientific researchers. We have some presence there.
Sur le plan des programmes scientifiques par l'Institut Paul-Émile Victor.
We have Paul-Émile Victor Institute there also supporting the researchers on the ground. But if we were to question those international treaties, it means that this region of the world will once again be open to military circulation and traffic, and this will have short-term repercussions, and will have defense-related repercussions, and you'll have even more tensions and conflicts.
Peut-être évoquer l'Arctique. Avec la fonte des glaces, on parle beaucoup de...
Okay, we talked about the Arctic with melting ice caps. We're all talking about new shipping lanes and routes. And the Norwegian MODs talked about what Russia is currently doing in the region, the Kola region, with the biggest warheads arsenal. Do you feel that there is reason to worry?
Par exemple, on peut imaginer que les Russes sont en train d'y bâtir un empire militaire.
Do you think that Russia is building a stronghold, a military stronghold, something to piss NATO?
Depuis des décennies,
I mean, for decades, the Arctic has been the largest Russian base. You've talked about the Kola Peninsula, and also during the Second World War, would go through moments, leaving the U.S. going through moments and helping the Red Army back then. And now we have submarines there in the region, getting closer and closer to the Mediterranean Sea.
Les moyens les plus significatifs. Et donc ce que
So here you have a lot of means, and the Arctic is where Russian submarines are deployed. Again, a real stronghold. Russians want to protect this area, so that's not new. What is new, though, is melting ice caps. In September, October, now we have vessels that can go throughout the whole area.
De manière beaucoup plus facile qu'aujourd'hui.
So now we have more lanes, and it would be easier maybe to export liquefied natural gas that is produced in Siberia and be sent to China.
Quelque chose qu'on verra dans les années à venir.
So it might be something you'll see in the years to come. Will it change international shipping routes? I don't think so. Now we have about, 10 vessels compared to tens of millions of boats that leave from China and all the way to Europe and whatnot. Cyril, anything else to say? No, the Admiral just said it all. If we're talking about cargoes here, it's not just about going from point A to point B. It's important to understand that they are unloading containers in different areas, not just point A and point B. So this new Arctic route will be a route to export raw materials. It won't necessarily be an international shipping lane. Now, for the military viewpoint, of course, this is a key area for European, NATO, and French interests. It's a huge area, so it's important to be able to anticipate from a military standpoint. It's important to make sure that we have enough wiggle room. We need to know about that area very well. We need to, again, talk about the sensors that we just mentioned on our vessels. And we need to have two things here. We need to have enough freedom to be there, and we need to have the technology that will help us conduct operations in these extreme areas. So we're talking about environment, and we need to have, we need to operate these climate operations, and we need to have access to ores that are lying in our seabeds. And seabed exploitation or exploration is something that we all think about now. How about mining, even though we don't really understand what it looks like? So we don't know anything about these areas, might release bacteria and whatnot. Do you really believe that there is financial resources there lying underwater?
En fait, alors, les fonds marins, c'est vrai qu'on en connaît très bien certaines zones.
We know very well some areas. The IEMFM provides licenses, for instance, so we have micro areas where we know very well what lies underground. So we have a sort of resources mapping. Now it comes down to using those resources.
Ce qu'il faut avoir en tête, c'est qu'il n'y a pas un épuisement des ressources à terre. On a des mines.
We still have resources on land. Some mines have to be reopened. Land resources are still available. We still have a lot of land resources.
De modèles économiques, de coûts d'exploitation.
Of course, it comes down to economic models, comes down to operating costs. And when you look at international mining operators, I mean, none of them want to look at what's going on underwater. They're still focusing on land resources. I mean, there's a Canadian company that is looking into it, yes, but the real household companies, I mean, they're not looking at underwater resources, not yet. Do you need a sort of a permit, Admiral? I mean, we could have a permit, yes. President Trump authorized seabed mining, and you also talked about impact, and we haven't even talked about impact. You know, for scientists, this is a no-brainer. When you drill somewhere where you have a mine, of course there will be repercussions.
notre pays pense qu'il y aura un gros impact. Et d'ailleurs, notre pays
And our country believes that there will be a large impact. And our country is at the spearhead of those who want to prevent and make illegal the use of seabed resources. So today we have biology experts, you have researchers who found once one fish, one starfish with 7 arms in the Pacific Ocean, 3,000 meters deep, just once. But what's going on all around the world? We don't know what's going on all around the world. Do we have more of those 9-armed starfish? So
détruira un grand nombre
using seabeds, resources, drilling might destroy all of this, because if you have mining exploration, what do you have? Well, you ruin it all, you destroy it all, and it's the reason why the French president is against underwater mining exploitation.
Aujourd'hui, donc
Julia,
là, on parle
anything
de
else to
profondeur,
add?
pour vous donner
I mean,
un
we
aperçu,
talked
les
about
fonds, en fait, ça va de 200 mètres
real depth. I mean,
11
you
000
know,
mètres de
here we
fond.
talk
C'est
about
un terme très,
200 meters up to 11,000 meters down.
11 000 mètres, mais on va pas rentrer dans les... Mais il y a des plaines marines.
So we have
Et donc c'est souvent
marine
sur ces plaines
meadows,
qu'on va essayer d'aller chercher les nodules
and
polymétalliques.
this is
qui
where
sont,
we go
une
and
des
look for
ressources
polymetallic
minières que l'on veut-
nodes.
que l'on veut
These
exploiter.
are
Et ces plaines-là, elles sont
mineral
autour de
resources that we
4 000
want to
mètres en
use,
moyenne.
and they lay
4 000
at
mètres, c'est
what,
très
4,000
profond. Et pour aller à
meters
ces profondeurs-là, on
underwater,
va
and it's
utiliser des robots.
really deep.
Alors, soit des
To
robots
do that, we
télécommandés
use robots,
avec un petit
robots.
fil, pour
remote
aller
control
jusqu'à 4 000 mètres. Mais si on
robots.
veut vraiment être efficace quand
But
on
if you
mine,
really want
il
to
faut
be
utiliser des drones,
efficient,
c'est-à-dire des
you need
robots
to use
autonomes.
drones,
Et aujourd'hui,
autonomous
on a
robots
des
then.
difficultés de communication.
And
puisque,
today we have a hard time communicating
ne
with
permet pas de
those
communiquer de la même
automated
manière que
robots.
dans
It's not
l'atmosphère.
easy to communicate underwater. It's
Et
trickier
donc,
than
il faut accepter de
up in
perdre
the
un
air.
drone.
So we need to be
Voire d'en
able to
perdre beaucoup,
accept
puisque,
to
par
lose
essence,
drones,
ils peuvent bugger
one
et,
drone
se
or
perdre.
several
Donc
drones
aujourd'hui, il y a quand même un enjeu
can get
au-delà de
lost at
l'intérêt
sea.
d'aller
So it's
chercher
not
des
just
ressources
about
qui sont
trying
très
to
loin,
look for
alors qu'on en a sur
faraway
Terre, mais aussi
resources, even though we have them on
une
land.
limite en termes
And on top of
économiques
that, you have
combien de
economic
drones on
restraints.
accepte de
How
faire
many
par
drones
gramme de
can be lost
de cuivre, de cobalt
compared to
qu'on a
how
récupéré.
much
Et je pense
how
que
much
c'est là
copper
où il
you
y a
might
aussi
get?
un enjeu technologique et de viabilité
So
économique.
it's about technology
Avoir le
and
mot de la fin,
long-term
peut-être, parce que
financial viability.
time out.
Captain, anything else? Time is running out, apologies. So one final comment. The French Navy has several operations from coastal areas up to the high seas. And of course, in France, it comes down to defending international law. And in the Pacific area, and I talked about this already. I mean, we have a key issue here when it comes to seabed, and we patrol there quite often.
De la défense du droit international.
And again, it comes down to protecting
regarde, on
and
n'a pas le temps
abiding
de
by
prendre une question, on
international
n'a pas
law.
le-
Unfortunately,
ça
we
n'est pas
do not
possible
have
parce qu'il y a juste
time
une main qui
to
se
take
lève.
one question,
On peut prendre une
or maybe
petite
one
question
question.
rapide.
Okay, one question.
Madame, c'est
Anyone?
pour vous.
Yes,
Vous
go
apportez un
ahead.
micro tout de suite. Zoé.
We'll get you a mic.
Merci Zoé.
Stéphane Achassin de l'association
Stéphane
Aïcargo.
Achassin
On travaille sur
from
la
the ecological
décarbonation de la
association,
filière
and we
transport et
work
logistique.
on
Et je souhaiterais savoir
decarbonization
comment la Marine
projects.
nationale
I'd like to
aborde
see
la
how the
question de la
French Navy
décarbonation de ses activités
is looking
et si on
into
peut,
decarbonizing its
si vous voyez des
activities,
synergies avec des
and
acteurs
if you
publics.
see whether or not there are synergies with public players. So very quickly, in our context,
Il y a toute une anticipation du cycle
we
de vie.
anticipate as much as possible the lifespan of our vessels, and it includes decarbonization, but also the reprocessing of the different materials that you might have on the vessels once we disassemble them. So it's the DGA, as of today, that works hand in hand with the industrial partners, and they're in charge of that specific process.
Volonté d'avoir un impact
So we
minimal
really want to have minimum impact
des conflits. Hein,
because on top of conflicts, it comes down to the betterment of an economic model, and it's completely aligned with the national approach and hopefully also the international approach when it comes to reducing our repercussions on the planet. You'll be able to ask questions to our panelists after the event, because unfortunately time is running out. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you, Amiral. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Captain. And thank you, Syria. Thank you for taking part in this round table. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.